June 4, 1942, 10:22 a.m., Pacific Ocean northwest of Midway Atoll. The USS Enterprise Air Group Commander Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky banks his Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber hard to starboard. Below, for Japanese aircraft carriers' steam information, their flight decks packed with armed and fueled planes. In exactly 5 minutes, the course of World War II will change forever. The morning had begun with disaster for the Americans. 3 waves of torpedo bombers, 41 obsolete TBD Devastators from the U.S. Navy aircraft carriers USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown, had hurled themselves against the Japanese mobile force in separate, uncoordinated attacks. The results were catastrophic. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet lost 14 of 15 aircraft. Only Ensign George Gay survived, clinging to a seat cushion in the oil-slicked water. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise lost 10 of 14 planes. Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown lost 10 of 12. Not a single torpedo found its mark. But the sacrifice of these 41 crews accomplished something their commanders never intended. Every Japanese Zero fighter had been drawn down to sea level, pursuing the slow, vulnerable torpedo bombers through their death runs. The combat air patrol that should have been climbing to intercept incoming dive bombers was instead circling at wavetop height, their ammunition depleted, their fuel running low. High above this carnage, 47 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown had converged on the Japanese fleet by pure chance. McClusky's 32 Dauntless from the Enterprise had been searching empty ocean for over an hour, burning precious fuel. His fuel gauges showed he was already past the point of no return, too far from his carrier to make it back. Then, at 9:55 a.m., he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northeast at flank speed, throwing up a distinctive white wake. The destroyer was the Erasure. She had been detached from the main force to depth charge the American submarine USS Nautilus, which had made a bungled torpedo attack on the battleship Kirishima. Now Erasure was racing to rejoin Admiral Chuchi Nagumo's carrier force. McClusky made the most important decision of the battle. He followed that wake. 15 miles ahead, the Erasure led them straight to the heart of the Japanese mobile force. 4 aircraft carriers steamed in a rough diamond formation. The flagship Akagi and her sister ship Kaga formed the southern pair. The carriers Soryu and Hiryu steamed 4 miles to the north. Surrounding them were 2 fast battleships, 3 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 11 destroyers. It was the most powerful naval formation ever assembled, the same force that had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. On the flight deck of the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood beside the ship's island superstructure, watching his air crews prepare for launch. The morning's attack on Midway Atoll had gone well. 108 Japanese aircraft had pounded the American base, setting fuel tanks ablaze and damaging installations. But the strike commander, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, had radioed that a second attack was needed to neutralize Midway's defenses. At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo had made a fateful decision. He ordered his reserve strike force, 36 torpedo bombers armed with deadly Type 91 torpedoes for use against American ships, to be rearmed with 800-kilogram land attack bombs for a second strike on Midway. The process was backbreaking work. Ordnance crews had to lower the aircraft by elevator to the hangar deck, remove the 1,700-pound torpedoes, then hoist up the bombs and mount them on the aircraft. Took over an hour. But at 7:28 a.m., everything changed. A Japanese scout plane from the heavy cruiser Tone reported 10 enemy surface ships bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles. Nagumo hesitated. Were these the American carriers he had been ordered to destroy, or merely cruisers and destroyers that could be dealt with later? At 7:45 a.m., the scout plane transmitted a second message that sent shock waves through the Akagi's bridge. The enemy formation included what appeared to be an aircraft carrier. Nagumo immediately ordered the rearming operation reversed. The torpedo bombers that had been loaded with land attack bombs now needed to be armed again with anti-ship torpedoes. Ordnance crews began the laborious process all over again, with bombs, torpedoes, and fuel lines scattered across the hangar decks. By 10:20 a.m., the Japanese carriers had recovered the aircraft returning from the Midway strike. Planes crowded every inch of flight deck space. The Akagi alone carried 21 Zero fighters, 18 D-3A Val dive bombers, and 15 B-5N Kate torpedo bombers. All were armed, fueled, and ready for launch. Similar scenes played out on the Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. In total, the four carriers held over 200 combat aircraft. Nagumo gave the order at 10:20 a.m. Launch when ready. The Akagi began turning into the southeast wind. Flight deck crews in their color-coded jerseys. Yellow for plane directors, red for ordnance handlers, blue for aircraft handlers, swarmed around the waiting aircraft. Pilots climbed into their cockpits and began engine start procedures. At 10:24 a.m., the Akagi's air officer raised a white flag. The first Zero fighter of the Combat Air Patrol began its takeoff roll, gathering speed down the 850-foot flight deck. In 5 minutes, all aircraft would be airborne, formed up, and heading northeast to strike the American carriers. The Japanese striking power that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months was about to be unleashed again. But 15,000 feet above the Japanese fleet, Wade McClusky was pushing his SBD Dauntless into a steep dive. His engine RPM was set to high, his propeller in high pitch to avoid overspeeding. As the massive shape of the aircraft carrier Kaga filled his telescopic bombsight, McClusky deployed his perforated dive brakes, the split flaps that would keep his Dauntless stable in a 70-degree dive. Simultaneously, 17 SBD Dauntless from the Yorktown's Bombing Squadron 3, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, rolled into their dives on the carrier Soryu. These pilots had launched an hour after the Enterprise strike, but their direct route to the target had brought them over the Japanese fleet at exactly the same moment as McClusky's squadrons. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading Bombing Squadron 6 from the Enterprise, initially followed McClusky's lead toward the Kaga. But seeing that the larger target was already under attack, Best made a split-second decision. He pulled his 6 Dauntless out of their dives and re-entered the attack pattern, selecting the flagship Akagi as his target. The Japanese were caught completely off guard. Their radar could not detect aircraft at high altitude. Their lookouts were focused on the torpedo bomber survivors limping away at sea level. The Combat Air Patrol fighters were still climbing back to altitude after their engagements with the American torpedo squadrons. On the bridge of the Akagi, a lookout suddenly screamed, "Hell divers!" He pointed skyward, where black dots were growing rapidly larger against the morning sun. But the warning came too late. The American dive bombers were already in their attack dives, hurtling earthward at terminal velocity. From the rear cockpit of his SBD Dauntless, Aviation Radioman Second Class John Snowden watched the Japanese carrier grow enormous in his field of view. He was flying with Lieutenant Norman Dusty Kleiss of Scouting Squadron 6, diving on the Kaga from 15,000 feet. The carrier's flight deck was crowded with aircraft, their wings touching wingtip to wingtip. Fuel hoses snaked across the wooden planking where refueling operations had been hastily completed. It was a perfect target. Kleiss held his dive angle steady at 70 degrees, his airspeed locked at 240 knots by the perforated dive brakes. In his telescopic sight, he could see the large red circle of the rising sun painted on the carrier's flight deck. That was his aiming point. At 2,000 feet altitude, he squeezed the bomb release lever on his left console. The 1,000-pound general-purpose bomb separated cleanly from the SBD's centerline bomb rack. Its arming wire pulled free, activating the impact fuse. Kleiss immediately pulled back hard on his control stick, initiating a 4G recovery that pressed him deep into his seat. Below, his bomb struck the Kaga's flight deck just aft of the island superstructure. The explosion was devastating. The bomb penetrated the wooden flight deck and detonated in the upper hangar, where fully armed and fueled aircraft were parked in tight rows. Secondary explosions rippled through the hangar as aircraft fuel tanks and bomb loads detonated in chain reaction. Within seconds, the entire after section of the ship was a roaring inferno. Similar scenes unfolded aboard the Akagi and Soryu. Lieutenant Best's 1,000-pound bomb struck the Akagi's midship elevator, penetrating to the hangar deck where it exploded among armed Kate torpedo bombers. The blast ignited aviation gasoline and triggered secondary explosions that quickly spread throughout the ship. On the Soryu, 3 direct hits from the Yorktown dive bombers set off a series of explosions that gutted the carrier's aviation spaces. In less than 5 minutes, from 10:24 to 10:29 a.m., 3 of the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were burning wrecks. The mobile force that had terrorized the Pacific was effectively destroyed. The momentum of the Pacific War had shifted irreversibly in favor of the United States. From his rubber seat cushion floating in the oil-stained water, Ensign George Gay of Torpedo Squadron 8 had a front-row seat for the dive-bombing attack. The sole survivor of his squadron's annihilation, Gay watched in amazement as the SBD Dauntless plummeted out of the sky like birds of prey. He saw the bombs detach from their aircraft and watched the massive explosions that turned the Japanese carriers into funeral pyres. Later, Gay would write, "The dive bombers were coming down like they meant business. They were coming down in steep dives, and every one of them was pointed right at those carriers. When those bombs started hitting, those carriers just went up in flames and smoke. It was a beautiful sight from where I was floating. The Japanese were stunned by the speed and precision of the American attack." On the bridge of the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo watched in horror as his flagship burned around him. Rear Admiral Ryanosuke Kasaka, Nagumo's chief of staff, would later record, "There was a terrific fire, bodies all over the place. Planes stood tail up, belching livid flames and jet-black smoke, making it impossible to bring the fires under control. The damage was catastrophic and irreversible. The Akagi had taken only 1 direct hit, but it proved fatal. The bomb had exploded among fully armed and fueled aircraft, triggering secondary explosions that quickly spread throughout the ship. Nagumo and his staff were forced to abandon the bridge, escaping through the forward windows by rope and transferring to the light cruiser Nagara. Captain Taijiro Aoki, commanding officer of the Akagi, remained aboard his burning ship, directing damage control efforts until the end. At 3:50 a.m. on June 5th, after Nagumo had rejoined the retreating Japanese fleet, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto gave the order to scuttle the great carrier. 4 Japanese destroyers fired Type 93 torpedoes into the Akagi's hull, sending her to the bottom after 16 years of service. The Kaga suffered an even more devastating fate. 9 SBD Dauntless from the Enterprise had attacked her simultaneously. 4 1,000-pound bombs found their target, striking the forward, middle, and after sections of the flight deck. The bomb that hit closest to the bow exploded just forward of the bridge, igniting a gasoline truck and spreading fire throughout the ship's nerve center. Captain Jisaku Okada and most of his bridge crew were killed instantly. Commander Takahisa Amagai, the Kaga's air officer and senior surviving officer, took command of the carrier and fought desperately to save his ship. But the fires had spread too far and too fast. The entire flight deck was ablaze, with aircraft fuel and ammunition cooking off in continuous explosions. By afternoon, the Kaga was a gutted hulk, abandoned by her crew and drifting helplessly. The Soryu met a similar fate. 3 1,000-pound bombs from Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's Yorktown squadrons struck the carrier in rapid succession. The explosions occurred among closely packed aircraft on the hangar deck, creating an inferno that consumed the ship's aviation facilities. Within minutes, the Soryu was burning from stem to stern, her crew abandoning ship as flames reached the bridge. Only the Hiryu, steaming 4 miles north of her sister carriers, escaped the initial dive-bombing attack. The Enterprise squadrons never saw her through the cloud cover. But Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding Carrier Division 2 from the Hiryu, was not content to merely survive. At 11 a.m., just 40 minutes after the devastating attack on the other 3 carriers, Yamaguchi launched a hasty retaliatory strike. 18 D-3A Val dive bombers and 6 A-6M0 fighters, all that remained combat-ready aboard the Hiryu, took off to attack the American carriers. They were guided by information from Japanese scout planes and the testimony of captured American aircrews. At noon, they found the USS Yorktown and attacked with the fury of desperate men. The Yorktown's combat air patrol fought valiantly, but the Japanese pilots pressed home their attack with suicidal determination. 3 bombs struck the American carrier, blowing a hole in the flight deck and knocking out all but one of her boilers. The damage forced Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher to transfer his command staff to the heavy cruiser Astoria. But the Yorktown's damage control parties worked miracles. Within an hour, they had patched the flight deck and restored power to several boilers. The carrier was making 19 knots and recovering aircraft when the second wave from the Hiryu arrived at 2:45 p.m. 10 B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, escorted by 6 fighters, attacked from multiple directions. 2 torpedoes struck the Yorktown's port side, flooding her engine rooms and causing a severe list. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered "Abandon ship" at 3 p.m., and the crew began evacuating the wounded carrier. The Yorktown would survive until June 7th, when the Japanese submarine I-168 put 2 more torpedoes into her hull, finally sending the gallant ship to the bottom. But the Hiryu's revenge was short-lived. At 5 p.m. on June 4th, 24 SBD Dauntless from the Enterprise and Yorktown, flying from the Enterprise after their own carrier was damaged, found the last Japanese carrier. Despite being defended by more than a dozen Zero fighters, the American dive bombers pressed home their attack with the same precision that had doomed the other 3 carriers. 1,000-pound bombs struck the Hiryu, setting her flight deck ablaze and destroying her ability to launch or recover aircraft. Admiral Yamaguchi chose to go down with his ship, along with Captain Tomio Kaku. At 9 a.m. on June 5th, Japanese destroyers torpedoed the burning hull, sending the Hiryu to join her 3 sister ships on the bottom of the Pacific. The Battle of Midway was effectively over. In one day of fighting, the Japanese Navy had lost 4 fleet aircraft carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, and approximately 3,000 men, including many of their most experienced pilots and aircrew. The United States had lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and approximately 300 men. But the true impact went far beyond the numerical losses. The Japanese mobile force that had dominated the Pacific since Pearl Harbor was destroyed. The myth of Japanese naval invincibility was shattered. Most importantly, Japan's ability to conduct offensive operations across the vast Pacific was crippled. After Midway, the Japanese would fight a defensive war, steadily losing ground to the growing industrial might of the United States. The 5 minutes from 10:24 to 10:29 a.m. on June 4th, 1942, marked the turning point of the Pacific War. 47 American dive bomber crews, flying obsolescent aircraft against overwhelming odds, had achieved what 6 months of fighting had failed to accomplish. They had broken the back of Japanese naval aviation and set the stage for ultimate Allied victory. Lieutenant Norman Dusty Kleiss, who scored direct hits on both the Kaga and later the Hiryu, would reflect years later on those crucial minutes. "We knew we had them. You could see those great ships just blowing up and burning. It was the most beautiful sight I ever saw. We knew we had turned the tide." The Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers that achieved this victory were remarkable aircraft for their time. The SBD, officially standing for Scout Bomber Douglas, was powered by a single Wright R 1820 Cyclone radial engine producing 1,200 horsepower. The aircraft had a maximum speed of 255 miles per hour and a range of 1,115 miles with a 1,000-pound bomb load. But the Dauntless' most important feature was its perforated dive brakes. These split flaps, mounted on the trailing edge of each wing, could be extended to create massive drag during a dive bombing attack. This allowed the pilot to maintain a stable 70 to 75-degree dive angle at a constant airspeed of 240 knots, giving him precise control over his bomb trajectory. The dive bombing technique itself was a uniquely American innovation. Unlike the German Stuka, which used a relatively shallow 45-degree dive angle, the SBD Dauntless was designed for near-vertical attacks. The pilot would approach his target at 15 to 20,000 feet altitude, then push into a steep dive that brought him to within 2,000 feet of his target before bomb release. This extreme diving angle served 2 purposes. First, it maximized bombing accuracy by minimizing the horizontal distance the bomb had to travel. Second, it minimized the time the aircraft spent in the enemy's defensive fire envelope. A Dauntless in a 70-degree dive was a difficult target for anti-aircraft gunners, since it was approaching almost vertically and at high speed. The bomb itself was typically a 1,000-pound and M65 general-purpose bomb, designed to penetrate armor decks before exploding. The bomb was equipped with an impact fuse that armed during the first few seconds of flight and detonated on contact with the target. Against the lightly armored flight decks of Japanese aircraft carriers, these bombs proved devastatingly effective. The success at Midway was also due to the exceptional training and skill of American naval aviators. Unlike their Japanese counterparts, who relied heavily on experienced veterans, American pilot training emphasized standardized procedures and tactics that could be taught to large numbers of new aviators. The dive-bombing attacks at Midway were executed with textbook precision, despite the fact that many of the pilots had never seen combat before. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky exemplified this American approach to naval aviation. A Naval Academy graduate and former fighter pilot, McClusky had transitioned to dive bombers only a few months before Midway. But his tactical decision-making during the battle, particularly his choice to follow the Arashi's wake, demonstrated the kind of aggressive, independent thinking that American commanders encouraged in their subordinates. The Japanese, by contrast, suffered from a rigid command structure that discouraged initiative at lower levels. Admiral Nagumo's indecision about rearming his aircraft reflected this institutional weakness. Had Japanese doctrine allowed for more flexible responses to changing tactical situations, the outcome at Midway might have been different. The intelligence breakthrough that made the American victory possible deserves special recognition. The work of Commander Joseph Rockefort and the codebreakers at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor was crucial to understanding Japanese intentions. By partially breaking the Japanese JN-25 naval code, they were able to determine that the attack would come at Midway and when it would occur. The famous AF deception played a key role in confirming this intelligence. When American crypt analysts suspected that AF in intercepted Japanese messages referred to Midway, they arranged for the base to send an uncoded message reporting a problem with its water purification system. When Japanese intelligence dutifully reported that AF was short of fresh water, the Americans knew they had correctly identified the target. This intelligence advantage allowed Admiral Chester Nimitz to position his 3 available aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, northeast of Midway, perfectly positioned to intercept the Japanese attack force. Without this advance warning, the American carriers might have been caught completely off guard, as they were at Pearl Harbor. The battle also highlighted the importance of damage control in naval warfare. American ships consistently survived damage that would have sunk their Japanese counterparts, largely due to superior damage control training and equipment. The Yorktown, despite being bombed twice and torpedoed once, remained afloat for 3 days and might have been saved if not for the final submarine attack. Japanese damage control, by contrast, proved inadequate when faced with the massive fires that engulfed their carriers. The decision to keep armed and fueled aircraft on deck and in the hangars, a consequence of the hurried rearming operations, turned what should have been survivable bomb hits into ship-killing catastrophes. The aftermath of Midway marked a fundamental shift in Pacific naval warfare. The Japanese, having lost most of their experienced carrier pilots, never fully recovered their offensive capabilities. American industrial production, meanwhile, was just beginning to reach full capacity. By the end of 1942, American shipyards were launching more aircraft carriers in a single year than Japan had built in the previous decade. The human cost of those 5 minutes at Midway extended far beyond the immediate battle casualties. For Japan, the loss of so many experienced aircrew, pilots who had trained for years and possessed irreplaceable combat experience, represented a blow from which the Imperial Navy never recovered. American pilot training programs, by contrast, were producing thousands of new aviators every year, ready to man the flood of new aircraft and ships rolling off American production lines. Lieutenant Richard Best, who led the attack on the Akagi, later reflected on the broader significance of the battle. "We didn't know at the time that we were changing history. We were just doing our jobs, following our training. But those 5 minutes, from the time we started our dives until the last bomb hit, those 5 minutes changed everything. After Midway, we knew we could beat them, and they knew it too." The technological legacy of the battle was equally important. The success of dive bombing at Midway validated American pre-war investment in precision attack aircraft and tactics. The SBD Dauntless would continue to serve with distinction throughout the Pacific Campaign, sinking more enemy shipping than any other American aircraft. Its successor, the SB-2C Helldiver, incorporated lessons learned at Midway and served until the end of the war. The Japanese, meanwhile, struggled to replace their losses. The new carriers they built were smaller and less capable than the ships lost at Midway. More critically, they lacked sufficient numbers of properly trained aircrew to man them effectively. Japanese naval aviation never again achieved the level of proficiency it had demonstrated during the first 6 months of the Pacific War. The strategic implications of Midway extended beyond the Pacific theater. The decisive American victory ensured that Japan could not achieve the quick, negotiated peace that had been the goal of their Pacific strategy. Instead, they were forced into the prolonged war of attrition that their leaders had desperately hoped to avoid. For the United States, Midway marked the beginning of the offensive phase in the Pacific. Within 2 months, American forces would land on Guadalcanal, beginning the long campaign of island hopping that would eventually bring them to the shores of Japan itself. The industrial and demographic advantages that had seemed abstract before the war now became decisive factors in determining the outcome. The 5 minutes that changed the Pacific War began with 41 American torpedo bomber crews flying to their deaths in obsolete aircraft. Their sacrifice, largely unrecognized at the time, made possible the success of the dive bombers that followed. In the confusion and chaos of naval combat, their desperate attacks drew the Japanese fighters down to sea level, clearing the sky for the SBD Dauntless. This pattern of American forces absorbing terrible losses while learning valuable lessons would be repeated throughout the Pacific campaign. At Guadalcanal, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, American forces would pay a heavy price in blood for each advance toward Japan. But unlike their enemies, they had the industrial capacity and manpower reserves to sustain such losses while continuously improving their tactics and equipment. The Japanese, by contrast, could never recover from the losses suffered in major battles. Each engagement depleted their pool of experienced personnel and irreplaceable equipment. Midway was the first and most dramatic example of this dynamic, but it would be repeated again and again as the war progressed. As the sun set on June 4, 1942, the burning hulks of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers drifted on the Pacific swells. The mobile force that had terrorized Allied shipping from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean was no more. In its place, 3 American aircraft carriers steamed eastward, their crews already planning the next phase of the offensive that would ultimately lead to Tokyo Bay. The 5 minutes from 10:24 to 10:29 a.m. had indeed changed history. In that brief span, 47 American dive bomber crews had accomplished what months of desperate fighting had failed to achieve. They had broken Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific and set in motion the sequence of events that would lead to Japan's ultimate surrender 3 years later. The Battle of Midway stands as perhaps the most decisive naval engagement in American history. In 5 minutes of precision bombing, the United States Navy transformed itself from a force barely holding on after Pearl Harbor to the dominant naval power in the Pacific. The young men who flew those SBD Dauntless into the teeth of Japanese defenses had not only avenged Pearl Harbor, they had secured America's future as a Pacific power. Years later, when historians would analyze the turning points of World War II, they would point to Stalingrad in the East, El Alamein in North Africa, and D-Day in Western Europe. But in the Pacific, the turning point was clear and undeniable. It came in 5 minutes on the morning of June 4, 1942, when American dive bombers fell out of the sun like the wrath of God and changed the course of history forever. The echoes of those 5 minutes would resonate for decades. The United States emerged from World War II as a global superpower, its Pacific Fleet the largest and most powerful naval force in history. The bases and relationships established during the island-hopping campaign became the foundation of American strategic presence in the Pacific, a presence that continues to this day. Japan, meanwhile, was forced to rebuild from the ashes of total defeat. The emperor who had ruled as a living god was forced to surrender on the deck of an American battleship in Tokyo Bay. The military culture that had dominated Japanese society was dismantled, replaced by a pacifist constitution imposed by American occupiers. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of those 5 minutes at Midway was the demonstration that determined individuals, properly trained and equipped, could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The 47 dive bomber crews who attacked the Japanese carriers were vastly outnumbered by their enemies. They flew obsolescent aircraft against the most experienced naval aviators in the world. Yet their training, courage, and precision proved superior to Japanese experience and numbers. This lesson, that quality could triumph over quantity, that democracy could produce warriors equal to any dictatorship, would inspire American forces throughout the remainder of the war and beyond. From the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of Vietnam, from the deserts of Iraq to the mountains of Afghanistan, American military personnel would carry forward the legacy of Midway. That 5 minutes of courage can change the world. The SBD Dauntless dive bombers that achieved this miracle were retired after the war, replaced by jet aircraft that could deliver nuclear weapons with even greater precision. But their moment of glory, those 5 minutes when they saved democracy in the Pacific, remains one of the greatest achievements in the history of naval aviation. Today, visitors to the USS Midway Museum in San Diego can walk the flight deck of the carrier that bears the name of that famous battle. They can sit in the cockpit of an SBD Dauntless and imagine what it must have been like to dive through flak and fighters toward an enemy carrier deck. They can honor the memory of the men who flew and died in 5 minutes that changed forever the balance of power in the Pacific. The Battle of Midway reminds us that history often turns on the actions of a few brave individuals in moments of supreme crisis. Wade McClusky's decision to follow a destroyer's wake. Richard Best's split-second choice to attack the flagship rather than follow the crowd. Norman Kleise's steady hand on the controls as he dove through anti-aircraft fire. These individual acts of courage, multiplied by 47 crews, added up to a victory that altered the course of human events. In 5 minutes on a June morning in 1942, the future of the Pacific was decided. The Japanese Empire that had seemed invincible just hours before lay in smoking ruins on the ocean floor. The American democracy that had been reeling from defeat after defeat had struck back with devastating effect. And the world learned that even the mightiest naval force could be defeated by determined men flying into battle with courage in their hearts and bombs in their bellies. The dive that saved Midway was indeed the best 5 minutes in naval history. In that brief span, American naval aviation came of age, Japanese naval supremacy was shattered, and the outcome of the Pacific War was determined. It was 5 minutes that changed everything, and the echoes of those moments continue to shape our world today.